Recently, Joe Heschmeyer from the channel Shameless Popery and Catholic Answers debated Ryan from the channel needgod.net on the question of baptism and whether or not it is necessary for salvation and regeneration. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on the debate overall, but I'll save that for another time, or you can watch any of the other litany of videos on YouTube that have gone in depth on this debate and kind of have reviewed it overall. What I want to dive into today, however, is one section of that debate where Joe referenced Mark 16:16 as one of his reference points or his reference texts for making the claim that baptism is necessary for salvation. Now that verse states, "Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned." Now this was certainly one of the stronger points that he made, or one of the stronger references that Joe made throughout this debate to try and prove his position of baptism being necessary. However, in response to this, Ryan implied that this passage did not need to be refuted because he doesn't believe that it belongs in the Bible.
Okay, so let's go to the text itself.
That should be that's what we should
Mark
be
16:16.
doing, rather
you
than
think it should be taken out of the Bible?
It's just not. It's not correct? In the Bible. Like if vast majority of scholars, and we looked, it's not in the earliest manuscripts that we have. In your English Bible, yes, and that's why there's a field textual criticism which they determine. Okay, so if you have, say, 1 John 5:7, is that supposed to be there? Is it not supposed to be there? Mark 16.
So if I'm getting you correctly, your argument isn't that Mark 16:16 disagrees with you. I didn't actually hear you make one argument that your belief is the same as what Jesus says in Mark 16:16. Your argument seems to be, and correct me if I'm getting you wrong, that Mark 16:16 both doesn't belong in the Bible and apparently is a false teaching that was added to the Bible super early on. Is that right?
So basically, it would be all we can do is base on the manuscripts that we have of Mark's Gospel. The earliest manuscripts don't have it. Even Eusebius in his day, he said the vast majority of the manuscripts in his day does not contain the longer ending of Mark.
Right, but I'm not. I understand that I understand the textual discrepancies. I'm asking you something else. Is it your position that Mark 16:16, the long form, is both false and not canonical and also false?
Yeah, I'd say it's not canonical. And is it false? Well, this is the thing, is that if it's not actually in the Bible, then it's not really even need to be dealt with.
Now, this was one of the more memorable moments of the debate because Joe seemed very surprised by this response. Even more so, the comment section on some of these videos in response to this debate have taken it to a whole other level, acting as if what Ryan just said pertaining to Mark was something that nobody in the history of Christendom had ever thought or had ever said, or something that no one had ever heard before, and that he was essentially making it up on the spot. Now, I'm fairly certain that Joe understands some of the discussion around this debate and around the longer ending of Mark. So I think his surprise was more so in the fact that Ryan was employing this as a response, which is a completely fair reaction. But ultimately, this video isn't for Joe because he most assuredly knows his stuff on this topic. The primary audience that I want to address, however, are those who are completely unfamiliar with this conversation and maybe are hearing about this for the first time. The responses to this debate from much of the general audience of this debate, like I said, in some of the comments of this debate itself and then some of the reaction videos, has demonstrated that many people actually have no idea what the contention or discussion around this actually is. And they don't understand why there's any controversy at all. And some don't even know that there is controversy. And some truly think that Ryan just pulled this out of thin air. So this is what I want to run through at a high level in this video. Some of the opinions, some of the perspectives, and some of the evidences for both sides on this discussion and on this debate. Now, the goal isn't to show where I fall in this discussion and to try to convince you of one way or the other. It's also not going to be a wholesale defense of Ryan's position on Mark 16 and his statements on this. Now, with the very important caveat that I think he does some really important and really good work in his evangelism efforts, I will say that I actually disagree with some of the definitive language that he uses in the debate pertaining to this specific section, especially on the topic of Mark. But he didn't invent this controversy. And it's also not some incredibly fringe position, whether or not we agree or disagree with the longer ending. So I want to evaluate this in 3 sections primarily. 1, I want to look at the evidence for the shorter ending and the evidence for the longer ending, including the view of the church fathers. I also want to look at the various views from some modern textual critics on this discussion. And then 3rd, based on the evidence that we look at, I want to conclude with what I believe to be the strongest case for the longer ending and the strongest case against it, or the strongest case for the shorter ending. Ultimately allowing you, the viewer, to take your research to the next level and draw your own conclusions. And of course, all of this should be done in humility and with lots of prayer. So let's dive in first to the arguments for the shorter ending. I want to evaluate what are some evidences for rejecting the longer ending of Mark. Now, one argument for the Gospel of Mark ending in verse 8, though it seems incredibly abrupt, is that it's an intentionally abrupt ending with some irony attached to it. Now, all throughout the Gospel of Mark, we see Jesus healing and commanding people not to say anything. However, they almost always ignore this command. Now, however, these women at the tomb are given a command to go and proclaim what's happened, and they're silent because the book ends. Some believe that this reveals intentional irony in the passage. If verse 8 is the last verse of the book of Mark, then the book ends with, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Now, another question that arises that provides some additional intrigue in this explanation is the reintroduction of Mary Magdalene in verse 9. In verse 1, Mary Magdalene is given an introduction. It says, "When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices, so that they might go and anoint him." But then in verse 9, we see, "Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons." At the very least, this seems like a bit of a strange addition if it truly is authentic. But it certainly is possible that she was reintroduced for some reason that we're just not aware of. Now, on to the next point, it's far more likely, based on the pattern seen in textual criticism, that a scribe is more likely to add additional content to a verse or to a passage rather than to omit something. Scribes would be highly incentivized in this context to add a resurrection appearance because this is the only gospel that does not have one. There is, however, a scholar who has good reason to believe that this actually was omitted by a specific group, and we'll cover that in our arguments for the longer ending. Now, 2 of the earliest manuscripts that we have, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, both from the 4th century, do not include the long ending. Additionally, the oldest Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, and Sahidic manuscripts end the gospel at verse 8. The next point is some church fathers like Origen and Clement of Alexandria do not mention the longer ending, though we certainly wouldn't want to make an argument from silence as our strongest argument in this case. Additionally, Jerome states that the passage was not present in the vast majority of Greek manuscripts or Greek copies that he was aware of, though he did include it in the Vulgate. Additionally, Eusebius states, "Accurate copies end their text of the Markan account with the words of the young man whom the women saw, and who said to them, 'Do not be afraid, it is Jesus the Nazarene that you are looking for.' After which it adds, 'And when they heard this, they ran away and said nothing to anyone, because they were frightened.' That is where the text does end in almost all copies of the gospel according to Mark. What occasionally follows in some copies, not all, would be extraneous, most particularly if it contained something contradictory to the evidence of the other evangelists. That, then, would be one person's answer, to reject it, entirely obviating the question as superfluous. It is important to note, however, that Eusebius did display that he was at least open to the possibility that this section was original. Now I want to look at some arguments for the longer ending being the legitimate or authentic ending. First, the vast majority of manuscripts that we have today contain the longer ending of Mark. The traditional ending of Mark, so familiar through the AV and other translations of the Textus Receptus, is present in the vast number of witnesses. The earliest patristic witnesses to part or all of the long ending are Irenaeus and the Diatessaron. It is not certain whether Justin Martyr was acquainted with the passage. In his apology, he includes 5 words that occur in a different sequence in verse 20. And then in Greek for Diatessaron, or Diatessaron, that means through 4. and this was a 2nd century harmony of the 4 canonical Gospels. Now, there is evidence for this ending found relatively early in the church, potentially as early as the 2nd century. Some of the church fathers that make reference to verses in the longer ending include Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Epiphanius, Nestorius, Cyril, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Chrysostom, Augustine, and Jerome, though he noted that the longer ending of Mark was absent in many Greek manuscripts that he had access to. He still included it in the Vulgate, as we talked about earlier. There's also significant geographic distribution, meaning that it's not just one sect of people in one isolated area who are reading and receiving this longer ending, but there is widespread attestation. The longer ending of Mark is not found in the oldest manuscripts, but it is found in the majority of manuscripts, and it is found in all the major text types: Western, Caesarean, Byzantine, and even the secondary Alexandrian. Thus, there is a broad geographical spread for these verses. Now, regarding potential omissions, there are some who argue that due to the potentially problematic nature of verses 17 and 18, which talk about drinking deadly poison and picking up snakes, or at least due to confusion regarding how to apply these, the contents of the larger or longer ending were simply omitted. This potentiality is inferred in William Farmer's book, The Last 12 Verses of Mark. So now I want to pivot to some modern scholarship conclusion and what we see from some various perspectives pertaining to whether or not they believe that this is the authentic ending, being the longer ending or the shorter. For scholars holding to the shorter ending, we'll start with Bruce Metzger, who states, on the basis of good external evidence and strong internal considerations, it appears that the earliest ascertainable form of the Gospel of Mark ended with 16:8. At the same time, however, out of deference to the evident antiquity of the longer ending and its importance in the textual tradition of the Gospel, the committee decided to include verses 9 through 20 as part of the text, but to enclose them within double square brackets to indicate that they are the work of an author other than the evangelist. Now, regarding the reason for the absence of the long ending in the earliest manuscripts, Metzger believes that there are 3 possibilities. First, he believes that this is where the author intended to end the gospel. We talked about the potential for irony, or that this was intentional and that there was a specific message that was being portrayed or relayed by ending it in such an abrupt fashion. The second possibility is that the gospel was simply never finished. And then the third is that the gospel lost its last leaf before major multiplication by transcription. And this is what he believes to be the most likely case. Now, moving on to another scholar, Dr. Daniel Wallace, executive director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts and senior research professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, also believes the longer ending is not authentic. He evaluates the ending of Mark in depth, namely in a class that he taught on textual criticism for biblicaltraining.org, which I will try to link down below. In this, he states, although at first glance the evidence is overwhelming on behalf of the long ending, a more penetrating analysis reveals that the earliest and best manuscripts and versions with the greatest geographical spread in the comments by Eusebius and Jerome about the majority of manuscripts in their day ending at verse 8. The multitude of endings before or in place of the long ending, the marginal notes in the manuscripts complaining about the long ending, and the overwhelming evidence from the linguistic uniqueness of this passage all argue that Mark ended his gospel at 16:8. And finally, we'll look at a scholar who does affirm the longer ending. In his book, The Original Ending of Mark, Dr. Nicholas Lunn gives his reasoning for why he believes the longer ending of Mark is the authentic original ending. He states, we have seen that while Vaticanus and Sinaiticus contain without doubt the earliest virtually complete copies of Mark presently within our possession, at the same time these date only from the middle of the 4th century. This means that in actual fact the evidence they afford is relatively late. Some considerable time prior to the production of the earliest surviving manuscripts, the fathers of the 2nd century church were in fact using the Markan ending as scripture. Since the text would require some years after its composition to become known and for its authority to become established, the ending must be dated on the basis of this evidence to around AD 120 to 125 at the very latest. In view of this latter evidence, it would be difficult to place the origins of Mark 16, 9 through 20 after the turn of the century. More than this, the present work has provided indications by way of verbal allusion that certain of the apostolic fathers were also familiar with the ending. Most significant among these is Clement of Rome. The writing of Clement's first epistle is commonly placed within the last decade of the first century, and his provenance Rome is the same as that traditionally ascribed to Mark's gospel. This would push the origins of the ending back earlier still, to the time in fact when modern scholarship assigns the writing of the second gospel itself. So now I want to look at the strongest evidence for the shorter ending versus the strongest evidence for the longer ending, in my opinion. And maybe you believe that there are stronger pieces of evidence for either side. Now, I believe the strongest pieces of evidence for the shorter ending are that two of the earliest manuscripts that we have, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, both from the 4th century, do not include the long ending. In addition to this, the oldest Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, and Sahidic manuscripts end the gospel at verse 8 as well. Now, for the strongest evidence for the longer ending, I think that the attestation and usage of these verses by the early church fathers going all the way back into the 2nd century is very strong, and it certainly is significant and something that we should very carefully consider. So in conclusion to all this, like I said, I'm not going to try to definitively state my position on this, and I'm not going to try to convince you of one way or the other. But I think that this discussion overall should show us that it is anything but conclusive. For millennia, people have been arguing over whether or not the longer ending of Mark is authentic and is truly a part of Scripture. Believing the shorter ending is the authentic one is not just some fringe position or one that was being pulled out of thin air. It is one that not only some church fathers held to and recognized, but some critical manuscripts did as well by omitting this and not including it in those manuscripts. Now, at the same time, it is certainly not conclusive that the longer ending of Mark is inauthentic. It is also not conclusive that it is authentic. And for that reason, a great deal of humility is in order here as we're having discussions on this topic, especially for those implying that the church has never debated this and that Ryan essentially made it up on the spot, which is an argument or a comment that I saw a good bit. There are brilliant minds on both sides of the debate, and therefore this topic is worth doing your own additional research on. So hopefully this video at least gave you at a high level some context regarding the core of the argument, and hopefully it empowers you to go and research these things for yourself, to draw your own conclusions, and above all, to spend time in prayer asking God for wisdom and clarity in these matters. As I so often say, let's be humble in these conversations, understanding that sometimes we're wrong and that it is only by God's grace that we all care about these things in the first place. So let's be grateful that we want to engage in these discussions, that we want to talk about these things that matter, that are significant, and ultimately that we want to glorify God, because that in and of itself is a grace of God.